My God, I hate drugs.
The country's third telco Mislatel consortium hurdles a major roadblock. This after Senate allowed the transfer of ownership of a firm that's part of the consortium. Our Joyce Ilas tells us the details.
Despite alleged violations to the terms of its franchise, the Senate clears the way for Mislatel to operate under another owner. It adopted a resolution allowing the transfer of Mislatel's controlling interest to a consortium, which government earlier named as the third telco. The ownership transfer and subsequently that of the franchise was the major hurdle for the consortium to operate as third telco. The consortium is composed of Mislatel, Davao-based businessman Dennis Uys Udena Corporation, and its unit Chelsea Logistics Holding Corporation, and Chinese government-owned China Telecom. Senators Franklin Drilon, Panfilo Lacson, and Risa Ontiveros opposed the measure.
Clearly, that would weaken the power of Congress insofar as monitoring compliance with the privilege granted, with the conditions imposed on the privilege granted.
During the plenary debate, Drilon argued that Mislatel's franchise has been automatically revoked because of a number of violations. First, it failed to operate within a year after it received its franchise in 1998, and it failed to offer 30% of its outstanding capital stock to the public within 5 years from the start of operation.
The non-operation, Mr. President, does not prevent them from complying with the dispersal of ownership.
Hindi po, wala lang pong bibili.
Ha?
Wala lang pong bibili.
Hindi naman po kailangan may bibili. Ang importante yung i-offer mo. They again is in violation of Section 16.
They did not comply with Section 16, Mr. President.
Drilon adds Mislatel violated again its franchise for failing to seek congressional approval when it transferred about 75% of its shares to its new owners in 2015. Senate Public Services Committee Vice Chairman Francis Escudero, however, pointed out that the committee does not consider the franchise revoked.
The committee took the position that in only one of two ways can a franchise lose effectivity. One would be by the filing of a quo warranto proceeding, or two, Congress at any point in time voting to either revoke or repeal the franchise granted for violations of the provisions thereof.
The Senate's decision avoided a possible rebidding for the third telco and back to square one for the selection committee in finding ways to improve the quality and affordability of telecommunications service.
Question of fact, Mr. President. Did Mislatel comply with the terms of Section 16?
According to the representatives of Mislatel, Mr. President, they did not make a public offering equivalent to 30% of their shareholdings, owing to their non-operation, Mr. President.
The non-operation, Mr. President, does not prevent them from complying with the dispersal of ownership.
Hindi po, wala lang pong bibili.
Ha?
Wala lang pong bibili.
Hindi naman po kailangan may bibili. Ang importante yung i-offer mo.
The gentleman is correct, Mr. President. We submit.
So they again is in violation of Section 16.
They did not comply with Section 16, Mr. President.
Section 16. And yet, notwithstanding that non-compliance, the committee report seeks the approval of this chamber in the transfer of shares from from the present stockholders, from Mr. From Mr. Escalante to the new group.
Udena, Chelsea, and China Telecom, Mr. President.
Paper you give. Can I ask for a 1-minute suspension just before we session suspended? approve on third reading a number of franchises. House Bill 5654, for example, granting a legislative franchise to Cotabato Electric Cooperative, and a number of other franchises that is on the calendar. In all of these franchises, the pertinent section provide on stock dispersal, on operation, on operation, still contain the ipso facto revocation. Given that the committee report, and I assume the majority will approve this committee report, how do we now interpret this provision in the franchises that we just approved, in case in the future we are confronted with a similar situation?
Mr. President, again, this is something for the committee to look at and review insofar as strengthening and or clarifying some of the provisions. But during the committee hearing, what came out, Mr. President, and the basis of coming out with the report, the committee took the position that in only one of two ways can a franchise lose effectivity. One would be by the filing of a co-warrant of proceeding against the franchise holder for any violation of the terms of the franchise granted by Congress, or two, Congress at any point in time voting to either revoke or repeal the franchise granted for violations of the provisions thereof. That was the position taken by the committee,
So
Mr. President.
shouldn't the committee now say this franchise is valid until revoked, notwithstanding failure to comply with certain provisions?
We would be amenable, Mr. President, to insert such language, which would again, I join the good gentleman in raising these issues to make sure na hindi po mauunsame itong third telco.
Or sasabihin na natin sa franchise, you don't have to comply because we will not revoke. Something like that.
Hindi naman po, Mr. President. Mr. President, when the House of Representatives discussed and deliberated on this, some if not all of these issues and concerns were raised and discussed by the House. The House, sitting as a separate chamber in the exercise again of its collective wisdom, decided to grant and or approve the proposed transfer of shares. And they took into account these concerns and issues in so voting. The same is true, Mr. President, with the Senate. Now, it's the decision later on by the body, should we introduce language specifically tackling these issues and saying that given the assumptions or despite some of the concerns raised, that we are agreeing to the transfer, Mr. President, Your Honor. We are prepared to introduce language to that effect that would cure whatever defects or shortcomings the franchise holder may have at this time that we're voting on it, Mr. President, Your Honor.
Clearly, that would weaken the power of Congress insofar as monitoring compliance with the privilege granted, with the conditions imposed on the privilege granted. But again, I cannot subscribe to that proposition that we should weaken the powers of Congress in this regard. But as I said, we are in the minority. I have dissented from the committee report, and it is up to the majority of this chamber to act on this recommendation of the committee. We are a collegial body. In our wisdom, in our collective wisdom, you may certainly assert that we can ignore the violation. That is the lookout of Congress, but we cannot subscribe to that, Mr. President, for which reason we have dissented from the grant and will continue to cast a negative vote if this franchise is put to a vote. Thank you, Mr. President, and we no longer have any questions. We have established the matters that we want to establish on the record. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
We thank the good gentleman as well, Mr. President, but just to wrap it up, there is no rule of precedence insofar as this or succeeding Congresses are concerned. The next Congress, before whom the renewal of the franchise will be up for their decision, would be free to decide on this matter, perhaps all over again, and or consider these matters all over again, this time squarely, because it would deal on the renewal or extension of the term of the franchise. We thank the good gentleman from Iloilo, Mr. President, for his erudite interventions and improvements on the measure, Mr. President.
Mr. President, in Congress, the precedent is the act that we have done. There are no written decisions here, so it is the way we have acted on a certain matter that will be the precedent. And I am afraid that in future deliberations, this act of the Senate, the action here, will be cited as a precedent for anyone whose compliance with the law is put to test. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
We thank the good gentleman too, Mr. President, Your Honor.
We'd like to thank the Minority Floor Leader, Mr. President, for his insights, which have been very, very helpful, Mr. President. Mr. President, may we now open the period. No other member wishes to interpolate the measure. Move to close the period of interpolation.
Any objection? Chair hears none. The period of interpolation is closed.
Mr. President, move to open the period of amendments.
Any objection? There being none, period of amendments open.
May we recognize the sponsor, Senator Escudero, to propose these amendments.
Senator Escudero is recognized.
May I ask for 1 minute suspension, Mr. President.
Session suspended.
The entire second whereas clause. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, amendment is adopted.
On the same page, delete the entire third whereas clause. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? There being none, amendment is adopted.
On page 2, paragraph 2, after the words NTC Memorandum Circular 09-09-2018, delete the phrase quote, or the rules and regulations on the selection process for a new major player in the Philippine telecommunications market. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? There being none, amendment is adopted.
Mr. President, after this paragraph, before the last whereas clause, insert a new paragraph with the following whereas clause. Whereas concerns have been raised regarding possible violations of Section 7, 15, and 16 of Republic Act Number 8672 on the operation, transfer, and disposal of ownership, respectively, supposedly committed by the franchisee, semicolon, Mr. President.
Before we act on the measure, the minority leader is recognized. Senator Drilon.
Mr. President, from the hearings in the committee and from the interpretation this afternoon, it is clear that it is admitted that there were violations. And the way the amendment is being proposed, it would appear that there are just alleged or supposed violations. I think the records are clear. We will have no objection if we remove those qualifying adjectives.
May I request for a minute suspension?
Session suspended.
Alisin mo na lang.
Mr. President.
Session resumed.
Mr. President, during the break, we conferred with the minority leader. May we, in lieu of proposing the amendment, withdraw the proposed amendment, Mr. President, Your Honor?
The previous question is withdrawn.
Thank you, Mr. President. No further amendments, Mr. President, Your Honor.
With that, Mr. President, we move to close the period of amendments.
Any objection? There being none, period of amendments closed.
Mr. President, with that, we move to adopt proposed House Concurrent Resolution number 23 as amended. I so move.
Before the action, the minority leader is recognized.
We cast a negative vote on the motion, Mr. President.
All right. Any other? Senator Lacson?
I was listening intently to the debate just a while ago, and I could see the merit in the points raised by the good minority leader. I would like to disclose, no, and I feel sorry to do this, but I'm also casting a negative vote. I would like to disclose, that's why I'm apologetic, because the main proponent is actually my wedding godson. But I see the merit in the points raised by the minority leader. We will lose anyway, so I'm just manifesting my negative vote, Mr. President. Sorry.
All right. Senator Ontiveros?
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't mind, even if slightly, swelling the numbers of those who will lose the vote, but I wish to make of record as well my negative vote. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President.
All right.
There are 3 negative votes.
Yes. Any objection? There being none, with 3 negative votes, the resolution is hereby adopted.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move that we
Actually passed on second reading.
So we'll move towards other sponsorship
Adopted,
measures. Mr. President,
Yes.
we'd like to recognize our. Is this for sponsorship? Sponsorship? Huh? Ladies first. Mr. President, with the permission of the body, Mr. President, I move to transfer from the calendar of ordinary business to special order Senate Bill number 2203. I so move.
Any objection? There being none, so transferred.
Mr. President, I move to consider Senate Bill number 2203 and ask the Secretary to read the title of the measure.
Secretary will read the title of the measure.